The morning Dennis Hale discovered the eggs, the world around him felt as if it had paused just long enough for something impossible to slip through. He had gone into his backyard with no greater ambition than trimming back a wild hedge and planting a few tomatoes to keep his mind busy. The weight of his divorce and early retirement still hung over him like a damp winter coat he couldn't shrug off. At 55, he'd begun to convince himself that life had turned the page without him, leaving him stuck between chapters. But when his gloved hand brushed against something smooth and foreign beneath the soil, a current of curiosity jolted through him. He dug carefully, revealing a circle of oversized eggs buried with almost ritual precision. Mud clung to their pale shells as if trying to hide them from the world. Instinctively, he knew this wasn't the work of pranksters or forgotten livestock. Something older, rarer, and far more deliberate had chosen this patch of earth. As he cleaned one egg and felt the faint shift of life inside, a spark lit in his chest, something he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't joy exactly, but a stirring of purpose. He called the local agricultural office, expecting a mundane explanation. Instead, the voice on the other end spoke words that reshaped his quiet little world. A nearly vanished bird species may have returned, nesting in the unremarkable yard of a man who thought his best years were already behind him. Until that moment, Dennis's life had been defined by routines that felt more like obligations than choices. His mornings were predictable, coffee cooling on the kitchen table, sunlight landing in tired squares across the floor, silence pressing in from every corner of the small rental he now called home. The house was painfully empty compared to the one he once shared with Pauline and their daughter, Lily Grace. There were no murmured phone calls, no music drifting down the hallway, no family dog thumping its tail in greeting. Only Dennis and the lingering echo of everything he'd lost. His retirement from teaching had seemed like the right decision at first. The stress, the sleepless nights, the collapse of his marriage, it had all become too heavy to carry into a classroom of teenagers who sensed vulnerability the way wolves sensed weakness. So he stepped away, convinced he needed space to heal. But the stillness of his new life brought no comfort, only the unsettling realization that he didn't know who he was without the structure of his career or the rhythm of his family. His therapist urged him to find something meaningful to build, something alive to tend. That was why he decided on a garden, a simple act of nurturing to remind himself that life could still grow in broken soil. But as he cleared the hedge and uncovered the strange, mud-covered eggs waiting beneath, he realized nature had brought him something far more profound than vegetables, something he never would have dared ask for. When Dr. Harriet Vance arrived the next afternoon, her presence alone shifted the atmosphere of Dennis's quiet yard. She moved with the steady confidence of someone who had spent decades reading the wilderness like a second language. Kneeling beside the eggs, she examined them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum artifacts, her weathered hands steady and sure. As she lifted one egg, turning it gently in the sunlight, Dennis saw something flicker across her face, recognition mixed with disbelief. Her voice was low, almost cautious, when she finally spoke. These weren't the eggs of some ordinary bird. They belonged to a species that had vanished from the region before his daughter was even born, a species scientists had quietly stopped hoping would return. The news shook Dennis in a way he wasn't prepared for. Something rare and fragile had chosen his backyard, the same patch of ground he had been trying to tame for vegetables. Dr. Vance explained the history of the bird, the habitat loss, the slow disappearance, the belief that this part of the country would never see them again. Yet here they were, 7 eggs arranged in a circle like a forgotten promise. Protecting them wouldn't just be a task. It would be a responsibility heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a long while, Dennis felt the stirrings of a role he hadn't played since fatherhood and teaching had defined him. Someone who mattered in the survival of something beyond himself. The return of the adult birds happened the following evening, captured by the motion-activated cameras Dr. Vance had installed that morning. Dennis watched the grainy feed from his kitchen table, leaning so close to the laptop screen he could hear his own heartbeat over the hum of the refrigerator. When the first bird stepped cautiously into the frame, blue-gray feathers catching the infrared light, he sucked in a breath sharp enough to sting his chest. A second bird joined moments later, larger and more muted in color, the pair moving with deliberate tenderness as they checked the nest. Their quiet coordination mesmerized him. They took turns settling over the eggs, trading places with gentle touches of their beaks, as if confirming the other's safety before letting go. Watching them, Dennis felt a pull deep inside, a recognition of devotion, of partnership, of purposeful care. It reminded him of walking the halls of his school during exam week, offering steady reassurance to nervous students. It reminded him of late nights pacing with infant Lily Grace on his shoulder. The birds' unwavering instinct to protect their fragile future struck him with unexpected force. He found himself calling his daughter to share the moment, his voice carrying an excitement he hadn't heard in himself in months. When Lily Grace said she wanted to help watch for the adult birds during her visit, something inside him warmed. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was a bridge between past and present, between father and daughter, between the life he had lost and the one he hadn't yet imagined. As days passed, what began as a quiet discovery evolved into a swelling wave of community involvement. Birders, conservationists, students, and curious neighbors reached out after Lily Grace posted the first update online. What started as a simple account documenting the birds, quickly grew into a local sensation. Comments poured in, messages of hope, gratitude, disbelief that nature had chosen their small corner of the world for something so miraculous. With each new post, the story rippled farther, drawing in environmental groups and even reporters eager to share the rare recovery of a species believed lost. Through it all, Dennis found himself at the center of a whirlwind he never expected. The volunteers who showed up didn't overwhelm him. Instead, they formed an unlikely community around his backyard, united by the fragile lives under the hedge. Dr. Vance became a steady presence, meticulously tracking data and coordinating efforts with a calm authority that anchored the growing momentum. Constance, his elderly neighbor, became something of a gatekeeper, gently redirecting would-be visitors and offering wisdom in the form of warm casseroles and steady perspective. And Lily Grace, his once distant, resentful teen, returned again and again, drawn not just by the birds but by the purpose they awakened in her father. Together, they monitored the nest, charted the parents' routines, and created content that inspired thousands. For the first time since the divorce, Dennis witnessed something remarkable, his daughter choosing to spend time with him not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. But with attention came conflict. The call from the development attorney struck Dennis with the force of a sudden storm. Fairview Development, armed with permits secured long before the birds' return, planned to break ground on the vacant lot beside his home, just weeks before the chicks would be ready to fledge. As the polished voice on the phone attempted to sound reasonable and accommodating, Dennis felt dread settle in his stomach. Heavy machinery, noise, vibrations. The fragile sanctuary the birds had built would collapse under the weight of progress. He reached out to Dr. Vance immediately, and her response confirmed his fears. The chicks would not survive major disturbance. What followed was a flurry of action: emergency meetings, expert assessments, volunteers mapping foraging paths, and legal counsel preparing for a hearing that would determine the fate of the nest. The peaceful backyard became a hub of organized urgency. People from all walks of life offered their time and skills, unified by the belief that these birds deserved a fighting chance. Dennis found himself stepping into a role he never expected: advocate, organizer, protector. But beneath the logistics and legalities, he felt something deeper, an echo of the steady purpose he had once carried as a teacher. Protecting the nest wasn't just about the birds. It was about honoring something rare and vulnerable, something that had chosen his broken-down yard as a place to begin again. When the chicks finally hatched, 6 tiny lives emerging one after another over 3 days, Dennis wept openly, overwhelmed by the raw miracle of it. Their fragile bodies trembled in the nest as the parents cared for them with tireless devotion, bringing food, warmth, and shelter with a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Each moment captured on the cameras became another reminder of what was at stake. The 7th egg never hatched, and its quiet removal by the parents left Dennis unexpectedly shaken. He found himself grieving that small life even as he celebrated the 6 that survived. But grief, he realized, was part of the landscape of hope. News of the hatching spread quickly, intensifying public interest and sharpening the urgency of the upcoming hearing. Volunteers doubled their efforts, gathering evidence, strengthening reports, and preparing testimony. Lily Grace threw herself into the work, her social media updates reaching tens of thousands and inspiring a wave of public pressure. At night, she and Dennis sat together reviewing footage, leaning over charts, and talking in a way they hadn't in years. Somewhere in those long evenings, the distance between them softened. She began opening up about school, about college dreams, about fears she'd never voiced during the turmoil of the divorce. As the chicks grew stronger, so did their fragile reconnection, a reminder that healing rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it begins with small movements, barely visible, but profoundly alive. On the day of the hearing, Dennis walked into the municipal chamber feeling a weight heavier than anything he had carried since the collapse of his marriage. But as he looked out into the rows of supporters, Dr. Vance with her field notes, Constance with her steady gaze, volunteers clutching binders, and Lily Grace sitting proudly beside her mother, he felt something rise within him. Courage shaped not by certainty, but by purpose. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't rely on rehearsed lines or scientific terminology. He spoke from the quiet, cracked parts of himself, the parts that had been empty before the birds arrived. He told the commissioners how he'd found the eggs on a morning when he felt like a man waiting for his life to start again. He described how the bird's return had rekindled his connection to his daughter, how the fragile nest had given him something to nurture at a time when he needed to believe that broken things could still be mended. He told them that the chicks were more than a scientific anomaly. They were a second chance, not just for the species, but for everyone.